Hey guys, my name is Rebecca. Welcome back to Oz and Elsewhere. This week's video I wanted to make short and sweet and just do a classic book review because I read this book recently that is so good. I just want to spend 10 minutes trying to convince you all to read it. So the book I want to talk about is An Unruled Body by Ani Gjika. Ani Gjika is an Albanian American poet and translator. So she was born in Albania and then moved to the United States at the age of 18. And An Unruled Body is her memoir. And I think it's got, first of all, the best first chapter in a memoir of all time. It starts with her driving back from a work party to her home where her soon-to-be ex-husband is waiting because he's asked for a divorce. And literally the book opens on a scene of her masturbating in her car. And then the last sentence of the first chapter reads, I look at myself in the mirror. I am 33 years old, perhaps subconsciously willing my own resurrection, and no one else but my husband knows this. In our 6 years of marriage, we have never had sex. So with that opening, it's hard not to want to read more. And I wanted to open with that before I kind of go into what the book is about, because it's just such a good opening and it grabs you, and so I'm kind of cheating. I'm using it as the opening of my video. So basically the book is about Gjika's relationship with her own body and how... I just put this back on the table and I forgot that there's water there. Anyway, that's a blooper that I'm not going to edit out, just so you know that I'm human, if that wasn't obvious already. So anyway, so the book is about Gjika's relationship with her own body and the journey that she takes through life. So she braids kind of different eras of her life through the book. This includes her childhood in Albania and growing up. Like the first part of her life is under Enver Hoxha's dictatorship, and then he dies when she's about 7 or 8. And then Albania transitions to capitalism when she's 11, 12, and this very wild world of post-socialist Albania in the 90s. And the book then covers her family's emigration to the United States, as well as their time in the Seventh-day Adventist church. And then it goes into her marriage. So Gjika gets married to Ishan, who is a man from India that she met through an online writers group. And they were together online for several years before they meet when she moves to Thailand to work as a teacher. And then they get married. And they're married for over 6 years. And the book kind of chronicles their toxic, occasionally abusive marriage, which is characterized by verbal abuse, occasional physical abuse, and also crippling intimacy issues, as a scene from the book, as a scene from the intro. It says they were married the entire time and never had sex. And Gjika talks about how she was sexually assaulted as a teenager, actually as a pre-teenager, and how that fear and a whole bunch of other factors kind of stopped her from being able to have sex. And then the second half of the book kind of chronicles her journey with a sex therapist and her kind of journey to freedom and recognizing her body with, her subsequent sexual and romantic relationships, as well as her own independence and learning to stand on her own 2 feet. And an important theme in the book is her learning to trust her body and listen to her body, which is something that she isn't really taught to women, let alone women from Albania and other fairly conservative Balkan countries. And that's one of the most important themes in the book, and something that she repeats over and over again. And I want to talk a bit more about some of the other themes or kind of through lines of the book that I found really interesting. So one that I found harrowing, I'm not sure interesting is even the right word, is the frequent references to Albania in the 1990s. So she talks about how there's this collapse of this old totalitarian system, but then what replaces it is rampant capitalism that rapidly impoverishes a large deal of the population, mass migration, and it's accompanied by a marked increase in violence against women and what she calls rape culture. She calls it explicitly rape culture because she describes how, she and her friends were afraid to walk to school starting from the 7th grade or even earlier because their own peers, other boys, but also grown men, would verbally harass them, catcall them, grope them, follow them home, try to corner them. And there's also, and this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg, there's also rampant human trafficking and kidnapping and rape of her peers. And she describes this very terrifying, terroristic attitude towards women where, not women, young girls, specifically young girls, cannot walk alone, cannot leave the house alone because they are terrorized. But the way that this is just accepted in society and the way that it's kind of glossed over and how nobody really does anything from her perspective. She talks about how she could only rely on her friends, and her friends were the only ones. They all protected each other, made sure nobody was walking home alone, and looked out for each other in other ways because the adults in their lives just weren't doing anything. And obviously the worst thing that happens to Gjika is she is assaulted on the way to school or on the way home from school. I can't remember which. But the entire environment of this rape culture is deeply ingrained in her, and she kind of talks about throughout the book about the consequences of growing up with this, not just her intimacy issues, but the way that she is, alienated from her own body and doesn't trust herself and grows up with this fear of her body because of what's been done to her or what people have threatened to do to her. There's this really poignant issue there's this really poignant scene in the book. She talks about how she was 17 or 18 and skipped school to go to a beach town with her friend's older boyfriend and this boyfriend's friend. And when she comes home, her mother is furious and tells her, bans her from seeing these friends ever again. So Gjika attempts to commit suicide because, I forget the exact phrasing, but she says, it wasn't even the punishment, it was being told not to see my friends because my friends were the only ones protecting me and I was the only one protecting them. And that kind of brings me to the other major theme running through the book, which is the isolation that this kind of patriarchal, violent atmosphere creates among people, including within Gjika's own family. So Ani and her mother are completely incapable of understanding each other, even though they love each other very much, because of the generational divide where Ani is experiencing this rape culture in the streets and her mother just doesn't understand the extent of it or doesn't understand the effect that it has on her daughters. So she reacts in ways that just make her daughter feel more isolated, such as threatening to stop her to see her friends, even though her mother's coming at this from a perspective of wanting to protect Ani. There's also scenes in the book where because for Ani all of this is super normalized, she doesn't sometimes realize, and because she is a child when all this is happening, she doesn't realize how dangerous some situations are. Like there's one situation that, another really terrifying scene in the book where Ani describes walking with her mother behind a friend of hers who's with an older man, and her mother is saying, we have to stop this because your friend is in danger, and Ani says, no, because she doesn't want to look uncool. And then later the friend dies by suicide. So there are scenes where, because of this generational divide, Ani and her mother are unable to understand each other since they are both women in this patriarchal culture, they should be able to find solace in each other. And also their differing values as a generation make them incapable of understanding each other. So when Ani tells her mother that she's getting divorced, her mother responds poorly and is kind of angry with her, even though she never liked the husband, and she had even intervened when she heard Ani's husband shouting at her once and said, who are you to shout at my daughter? But when Ani says that she's getting divorced, she is furious with her and is kind of upset with her. And in the passage, the author is thinking, okay, well, she probably was upset because of this, and this, but she can only speculate. She probably speculates accurately because, usually we know what our mothers expect of us and exactly how we disappoint them. But she doesn't know for sure, because even here they can't actually talk to each other. That's interesting, how these generational divide and these very different values that they grew up in. So Gjika's parents, I think, are still involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they obviously belong to an older generation that's more traditional, while Ani grew up also in the church but questioned a lot of those beliefs, and after coming to America, especially after her divorce, starts to think in a very different way. And it's just kind of, these worlds are so different that there are people that should be finding commonalities are unable to do so. And the family members are not just isolated due to generational gaps, they're isolated by gender. So Ani talks about, even though her father is more progressive than a lot of other men in their community, he still holds very patriarchal values, and how her mother is still kind of in this role of the woman, and how she's, after they move to America, she's, doing a lot more backbreaking work, and it takes her a long time to get back to being a writer, while her father also works, but also makes sure to make time for his scholarship in a way that her mother does not get the privilege to do so. And what I find especially heartbreaking is Ani has a younger brother. I think the age gap between them is similar to the age gap between myself and my younger brother. And he doesn't get mentioned very often, but she talks about how they don't have a very close relationship. And she talks about how, she sometimes wonders, like, okay, what was his view of growing up in Albania? And what ideas did kind of he absorb? Was he one of those guys that was, chasing girls as they were going home from school? And their 4-member immediate family is kind of a microcosm of what happens in these kinds of very structured societies like the ones Ani grew up in, and also, the rest of the Balkans are not very different from Albania, where you wind up becoming very isolated. Everyone is pushed into their own role, and that's your role, and that you stay there. And even though Gjika is able to kind of unlearn some things as she grows older and return to her body and learn to listen to her body, that isolation between family members is something that is much harder to overcome. And the last major theme is kind of the body itself. So I loved the very embodied writing in this memoir. We start right off with a very intimate description of her masturbating. And she talks about sex, both the failed attempts at sex with her husband and the later times when she is able to successfully have penetrative sex with very intimate detail. But also the way she describes her body's reactions to certain situations. So she describes, being triggered into crying at certain situations, or the tension in her body. She talks about, listening to her body and learning to listen to her body and understanding what this reaction means, what this reaction means, and kind of the self as the body and coming back to the body. And another metaphor, she uses a lot of bodily related metaphors to talk about the rest of the things that she's describing. So she describes communism in Albania as a stew that everyone has to eat, and you have to say that it's delicious even though you don't really want to eat it, and it messes up your digestive system. There's a lot of these very embodied metaphors. And that brings me to what I actually really love about this book, which is the unflinching descriptions of the body, and the fact that she is talking about things that, Balkan women, Albanian women, you're not supposed to talk about them. You're not supposed to intimately write about sex and masturbation or about the violence you have suffered, even at the hands of your own father. And that's just something that's not talked about. And I really loved seeing that and seeing that honesty on the page. Because I think that's still subversive even in our day and age. I found it unflinchingly honest. I found it, there were some lines that really felt as if, even though, we're from a different generation, and I grew up abroad, and my parents are from Croatia, not from Albania, but a lot of what she described rang true for me as well. And a lot of the ways that she describes this omnipresent violence, it really felt as if someone was ripping my gut out and saying, okay, this is what happened to you, happened to me as well. And that was really cool. The one critique I have is it gets a bit lost towards the end. So the last few chapters I found a bit difficult to get through. The last end of the book focuses a lot more on kind of her post-divorce and her subsequent relationships with men. And I guess I found the part in Albania more interesting, which makes sense since I'm approaching it as someone from the Balkans as well. Well, maybe someone who's approaching it as an American feminist might find the second half more interesting, but I thought it lost it a bit, where it lost the immediacy and the honesty of the first bit, or towards the end, instead of kind of closely following her experiences, we get a lot more philosophizing of those experiences, including reflections on things that she's already written, but it gets a bit repetitive because as she's detailing certain experiences, she also reflects on them, so that it doesn't really make sense that at the end of the book, we're reflecting on it again, and usually without many new insights, just kind of repeating the same reflection. There was one particular incident where she talks about, she kind of telegraphs, she mentions a few times, like a very formative meeting with a man in Ireland, but then when we actually get to it, I found it anticlimactic, and the rest of my book club found it a bit anticlimactic as well. So that's the only thing where I thought the ending wasn't as strong as the beginning. But I want to qualify my criticism by saying, one, it's really hard to follow up a beginning like the bit that I read. And two, memoirs are hard to end anyway. If I haven't written one, I probably won't because I'm not that interesting, but I've written personal essays, and even with personal essays, it's really hard to find a place to end where it says, you give readers a satisfying conclusion, but it doesn't sound too much like a college essay where it's like, this is why I learned. And it's also hard to explain why you're ending at a certain point rather than, well, I decided to write my book now. Like, it's kind of, you're forced to create artificial closure for your own life. So I understand why maybe the ending didn't land as strongly as the rest of the book. But even with that caveat, I highly recommend reading this book. It's An Unruled Body by Ani Gjika. I read it with my Balkan Literature book club. There's been a string of memoirs by Balkan women recently that have really taken the literary world by storm, but outside of a few very writer-focused publications, I haven't seen as much buzz about this one, which I think is undeserved. I think anyone interested in kind of feminist writing, memoir, should read this, not just if you're interested in the Balkans. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next few weeks with another video.